All right, it's time to get Joseph out of the dungeon. So we're going to turn to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41. Remember what has happened to Joseph. Remember why he is in the dungeon. It is because of Potiphar's wife, who falsely accused him, and Jacob is thrown into prison because he refused to have relations with Potiphar's wife after she repeatedly chased him and tried to get him to do that. And he's been in prison, and while he was in prison, he used those administrative skills that God had given him, because that's what we see in Joseph's life. He was a brilliant administrator. He had risen to the top of Potiphar's house as an administrator, and then when he's in the jail, the jailer sees his gifts and abilities and turns everything over to Joseph, so he's administrating the jail. And what we're going to see is that Pharaoh raises him up to be a prince of Egypt, second in command of the nation of Egypt, because of his great administrative skills. So God had gifted him and used the gifts that he had given Joseph to put Joseph in the place that he wanted Joseph to be. But he is in prison because of a false accusation by Potiphar's wife. Then while he's in prison, he meets the chief baker and the chief cupbearer of Pharaoh, and they both have dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams, and he asks the cupbearer that when he is reinstated to his position, if he would please remember Joseph in prison and mention Joseph to Pharaoh so as to get Joseph out of the prison, because Joseph tells the cupbearer, I didn't do anything to be in here. I shouldn't be in here. I don't deserve to be in there, so remember me to Pharaoh. Of course, the chief bread maker was executed, but the chief cupbearer is once again raised to his position as the wine steward, if you will, of Pharaoh, who comes into Pharaoh's presence and basically pretty much stays there in Pharaoh's presence. And so this is where we left Joseph the last time. And in the very first verse of chapter 41 says, after 2 years. So the cupbearer immediately forgets what Joseph has done. He immediately forgets that Joseph is the one who prophesied through interpreting the dream that he would be restored, and he had failed to do what Joseph had asked him to do. So chapter 41, beginning in verse 1, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump. And they fed in the reed grass, and behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has a dream, setting the scene for Joseph being called out of the prison. And magicians, don't think of our modern day magicians, right? These guys are not pulling rabbits out of a hat or anything like that. These are the most learned men of the nation, right? They were advisors to the king. But none of them could interpret these dreams. And the reason is, we kind of look back on these dreams and we can see some sense in the dreams, can't we? Because we know the interpretation. But the dreams come from God, and the only way that you can interpret God's word is by the Spirit of God. That's part of what is going on here. The most learned people in the nation of nation of Egypt, these magicians and the wise men, that's what they studied. They studied the interpretation of dreams because the Egyptians were great believers in dreams, but they couldn't interpret these dreams. However, God is setting it up for Joseph's time in the spotlight. Verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Remember, that was Potiphar. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the guard, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. He had to shave himself because the Egyptians did not like beards. The Egyptians were weird people. Did you ever study anything about ancient Egypt and look at the pharaohs, their statues and stuff? They'll have a fake beard on. Even their female pharaohs, because they had some female pharaohs, would wear a fake beard as a symbol of their authority, but they wouldn't have any, they wouldn't wear a real beard. So they were strange people. They would pluck their beards, pluck the beard hairs out, their facial hair, and then put on a fake beard. But Hebrews, they like beards. So Joseph has a beard, but he has to shave it off so as not to offend Pharaoh. So he pulls the chief, the cupbearer, says, hey, I remember, I messed up. I should have told you this earlier. There's a young Jewish boy, there's a young Hebrew boy who told me and the chief baker about our dreams, what the dreams meant, and his interpretation came true. In other words, there's somebody in prison, the captain of the guard, who can interpret your dream, Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, so they pull Joseph up and they clean him up, make him presentable to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. In other words, no, it's not me. I can't do that in and of myself. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, and in Pharaoh, we're not going to read it all, Pharaoh recounts the dream that he had to Joseph. Look down at verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. In other words, both dreams mean the same thing. Pharaoh, both dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that come up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So there will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream, in other words, why you had 2 dreams that mean the same thing, both dreams are one, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. In other words, there's no stopping this. God has told you, Pharaoh, that this is going to happen. Now, then you may have the question, you're asking yourself, why is God so concerned about the Egyptians and not so much concerned about his people who he has a covenant with? Remember, he made a covenant with Abraham. He carried it on through Isaac and Jacob. And Joseph is Jacob's son. So why is God so concerned with Pharaoh and the Egyptians to warn them what is coming? It's not ultimately about Pharaoh and the Egyptians. It's ultimately about God's plan. It's ultimately about what God had told Abraham. Remember what God had told Abraham when he made the covenant? He said, your people are going to be strangers in a land. But after 400 some years, they're going to come back. And they're going to have all of this. But they're going to sojourn in a land where they're strangers. So in order for God's purpose and God's plan to be played out, God reveals this dream to Pharaoh, not for Pharaoh's benefit, but to put Joseph where he wants Joseph and where he needs Joseph to be, right? So God is using all of these things. He has used everything that Joseph has went through to prepare for this moment where he gives these dreams to Pharaoh, and the only person in the entire kingdom who can interpret them is the slave boy who's in prison. And thus Joseph goes from being a shepherd to being a prince of Egypt. Later we're going to see that Moses goes from being a prince of Egypt to being a shepherd. So God is using 2 different means to put 2 different men in the places that he wants them to be. to accomplish what his will is for his people. So Joseph goes from being a shepherd boy to being a prince of Egypt. So let's continue and see how that happens. So Joseph has just told him what the interpretation of the dream is. It's a prophetic dream. There's going to be 7 years of super abundant harvest, right? 7 years of super plenty, followed by 7 years of drought, severe drought. And then he says, verse 33, here's the administrator in Joseph coming out. Not only does he tell Pharaoh what the problem is, and this is what all good leaders look for in their people. Don't just tell me what the problem is, bring me a solution when you tell me the problem, right? So this is what Joseph does. He tells him what the problem is. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, and you're going to have 7 years of famine. Verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers of the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. I think it's instructive if we want to lay the personality and the way that Joseph approaches life up against his father. Can you imagine Jacob, the trickster, if Pharaoh had pulled him up out of the pit and said, I need you to interpret a dream? Don't you think Jacob would have tried to make a bargain with him, like he did with Laban and the sheep, like he did with his brother and the bowl of lentils, right? Jacob is a schemer. Jacob, later, we'll see in a couple of chapters, he gets angry with his other sons because they didn't lie to Pharaoh, or to Pharaoh's prince, Joseph, who they didn't know was their brother at the time, about Benjamin. He's upset because they told him he had another brother. Jacob is still a trickster. But we see a totally different person than either his mother or his father in Joseph. Joseph, there's no guile found in Joseph. Remember, he's where he's at because Potiphar's wife tried to entice Joseph to sin, but Joseph was not going to sin against God. So he doesn't sin against God, and because of that, he spends we don't know how many years in prison. And here is his chance. He's standing before Pharaoh, and rather than beg Pharaoh and try to get something out of what he has just done from Pharaoh, he doesn't glorify himself, he glorifies God. Joseph is always glorifying God in whatever he's doing. He said, no, Pharaoh, I cannot interpret your dream for you, but God will tell you what it means. God will speak through me and tell you what it means, but it's not me who is doing it. And then he immediately tells Pharaoh, who at this time is the king of the nation that he ended up in slavery in, right? The Egyptians had bought him as a slave, and he's been mistreated since basically the moment he walked into Egypt, right? Except when Potiphar had raised him up, and then his wife messed all that up. So Joseph has every reason to be angry against the Egyptians, to be bitter about his circumstances, which, and I would be hard pressed to think that I would be able to react as graciously as Joseph does in this story, because Joseph doesn't accuse Potiphar's wife. He doesn't say, Pharaoh, I'm innocent. You need to get me out of there. And he doesn't start pointing fingers. He doesn't look for a way to use the gift that God had given him as a way to better his own situation. Instead, his concern immediately goes to Pharaoh. His administrative skills immediately kick in, and he understands innately the way to approach the problem is to do what I'm suggesting to Pharaoh. Here's how you're going to survive, Pharaoh. Here's how not only you, but Potiphar and everybody else in the nation of Egypt is going to survive this famine. Here's what you need to do. And then Pharaoh says this in verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house. Okay, Joseph just told him, find some wise, discerning man. And Pharaoh says, okay, buddy, you're it. you're going to implement the plan you just laid out for us. So he identifies the problem and brings the solution. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put the signet ring. Back in those days, we don't use them today, but it carried the king's authority. So the fact that Pharaoh was giving Joseph the signet ring meant that Joseph was carrying, or he bore, the Pharaoh's authority. So whatever Joseph said, it was if the Pharaoh was saying it, because he carried his signet ring. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck, and he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. And thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah. Now, that's a very interesting name. There's some controversy about what it means, but there's something of a consensus that it means the God who talks and lives. In other words, there's a God who speaks, and he is a live God. He's not like these other gods, because Joseph interpreted his dream. It's important that he gives him an Egyptian name, because from now on they're going to consider him an Egyptian as opposed to a Hebrew. And Pharaoh called his name Zaphenath-Paneah, God who speaks and lives. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, not Potiphar, but Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. How old was he when he was sold into slavery? Anybody remember? 17 years old. So 13 years of being a slave, much of that time spent being in prison. But God, he was not forsaken by God. He never considered himself forsaken by God. He trusted God and knew that God was with him the entire time. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. He saved up so much grain that they lost count. It was just too much to count. Kind of like Terry's abundance every Sunday morning when we come in there. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. That does not mean he has forgotten about his father or his family. That means he has forgotten all the trouble that he had. God had blessed him so abundantly, and he's given him a child and raised him to this position. So, in other words, what's past is past. God has blessed me. Named his firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in this land of my affliction. Ephraim means fruitful. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, for what he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. That's chapter 41. Then we're not going to go. So questions about how Joseph gets out of prison, right? Cupbearer standing there when Pharaoh calls all his wise men in, and none of the wise men could interpret the dream. And the cupbearer suddenly remembers there's a young Hebrew boy. By this time he's 30. At my age, he's still a young Hebrew boy, but he was a grown man then. He's a young Hebrew who can interpret a dream. And Joseph comes up and said, no, I can't interpret the dream, but God will interpret the dream. The God I follow will interpret the dream. Joseph was well aware that of the covenant that God made with his great-grandfather and his grandfather and his father, and it flows right down to his father's children. This covenant with God, with Yahweh. And so he has put his faith and trust in that God, and he has followed that God, and he was faithful to that God. And so he glorifies the God. He glorifies God instead of glorifying himself and using the gift that God had given him to better himself. He simply uses the gift that God had given him to bless Pharaoh. Not only does he bless Pharaoh with the ability to survive the famine, Pharaoh gets filthy rich off of the famine. Notice what it said. Pharaoh says, you go to Joseph, do what he tells you to do. So what does Joseph do? Joseph sells them grain. Well, Pharaoh gets that money. That's Pharaoh's grain. We'll you can see later they're, pretty much bankrupting everybody in Egypt but Pharaoh. But that's part and parcel of a larger story that you'll come to in Exodus, that the nation of Israel is that one who actually plunders all of that. But we'll get there later in Exodus. Chapter 42, we have the first trip of Joseph's brothers to Egypt. Chapter 42, they hear that there's grain in Egypt because in Canaan they're under the famine as well. So Jacob sends his sons, except Benjamin, he sends the 10 to Egypt to buy grain. And there's a couple of interesting things in there about, turn to all right, verse 40, chapter 42. Let's just start at verse 1. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at one another? And he said, behold, I've heard that there's grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us, that we might live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might come to him. Thus the children of Israel came to buy among others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Jacob has not learned his lesson with Joseph. He's still playing favorites. Benjamin is his favorite. Benjamin is the new favorite. He's the new Joseph. He took Joseph's spot, right? So what did the 10 brothers do to Joseph? They threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery, and lied to their dad about him being dead. So the same dynamic should be playing on here, that Benjamin has taken the place of the unloved brother. Now it's Benjamin. And so when I told you, I think last week, might have been the week before, I don't know, that ultimately the story of Joseph is the story of redemption, about the growth and redemption of his brothers. That's the whole purpose. So when we read in chapter 42, the interactions, and chapter 43 and 44, the interaction between Joseph and his brothers, and some of it is hard to understand. Why would Joseph treat them this way? Why is Joseph doing this to them? Right? Because Joseph plays some tricks on them. Right? They come, they buy grain. Joseph said, you're spies. Why are you coming here to spy out the land? Because he recognizes them, and he knows that they didn't bring Benjamin. So he gets them to admit who they are and that they have another brother, and why they have another brother. And it's because their father loves that brother more than anybody else, because the one he really loved was dead, and they didn't recognize Joseph. So Joseph puts Simeon in custody and says, you cannot come back. If you come back here without your younger brother, then I'll know that you're spies and I'll come against you. But if you bring your younger brother, I'll know that you're telling the truth, and I'm going to keep Simeon here to make sure that you come back. Well, obviously, they go back to their father and they don't come back because they're afraid to come back. They're afraid to go back with Benjamin because, hey, they almost killed their daddy with the death of Joseph, what they thought was the death of Joseph, but they're not going to do it. And Jacob is not going to let Benjamin go. And finally, Judah steps up and says, look, I'll be a surety for him. I will be a surety that Benjamin will come back, but we cannot go get grain unless Benjamin goes with us. Reuben even went so far to says, if Benjamin doesn't come back, you can kill my children, right? Which is stupid, telling your grandfather to kill your grandchildren. Because anyhow, finally Jacob says, okay, you can take Benjamin back, but if something happens to Benjamin, that's the death of me. And obviously I'm paraphrasing quite a bit, but I'm trying to hurry the story along. But so they bring Benjamin back, and I think we want to talk about that interaction more in detail than we have time for tonight. But let's just say that Joseph hides something in Benjamin's sack, as if Benjamin is a thief. And remember, all of these interactions are, Joseph is designed to bring his brothers to a realization of what they had done, and to see if they had grown, if they were remorseful, and see if they would treat Benjamin any differently. So now he has Benjamin where he wants him, because they have come back and said, if somebody stole from you, you can have him. If one of us stole from you, you can have him. So they open all the sacks, and there, lo and behold, it's in Benjamin's sack. And there's the whole point of all of these interactions. What are you going to do with the loved son? What are you going to do with your beloved brother, the one that your father loves more than he loves you? Are you going to do what you did last time? Are you going to do what you did with Joseph? Or what are you going to do with Benjamin? Have you grown any? Have you come to a place of repentance and redemption? And we see that Reuben, they don't know that Joseph can speak Hebrew, and we see that Reuben is saying, see, I told you we shouldn't have hurt Joseph. This is God paying us back for what we did to Joseph. See, I told you you shouldn't have done that. And then Judah is the one who stands up before Joseph, who he still doesn't know is Joseph, and says, let me take his place. Let me stay in slavery, but send the boy back, because if the boy doesn't come back, my father will die and go to Sheol, right? So Judah is the brother who is willing to lay his life down for Benjamin, who was getting the same treatment that Joseph had gotten that got him into trouble. Remember, it was Judah who was the one whose idea it was to sell Joseph into slavery. Now Judah has come to a place of redemption, which we'll look at next time, whereby he is willing to surrender the rest of his life and serve Benjamin's sentence. So let's leave that cliffhanger right there where it's at, and we can talk about that later. So questions, comments, concerns? Now, that was a very short overview of the interactions. Go back and read it. So go back and read the interaction between Joseph and his brothers. But always keep in mind, Joseph's ultimate goal is to bring about the redemption, the reconciliation of the family, right? There was a split in the family 13 years ago when they sold him into slavery. Joseph's object here is to bring them all back together. But you got to know that Joseph had those initial dreams that God gave him in his mind while all this is going on. His brothers come in and bow down to him.
Pastor?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I noticed that in my Bible, at least, they use Jacob and Israel interchangeably, the two different names that he was given.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, 42, beginning it calls him Jacob, and then later on it says Israel's son. So they use both the names, but he was given a different name, Israel, by God, wasn't he?
Yeah, in chapter 32 of Genesis, when Jacob wrestles with God, we see in verse 27, God says to Jacob, he says, and he said to him, he being God and him being Jacob, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he, God, said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So God gives him a new name in chapter 32, but they're used interchangeably like Simon and Peter in the New Testament. So when God granted a new name, it didn't replace their previous name. It added an additional character trait, if you will, or an additional truth about them. Israel means God strives for. So he renamed Jacob as trickster, which is what Jacob means. You're the trickster, but your new name, the new thing that is going to be true about you is that I'm going to strive for you, that God will fight for you. So that's what Israel means, that God will strive. So it's instead of Jacob striving, now God is striving for Jacob. It's the moment when the Abrahamic covenant is passed on through Jacob. If that helped or made any sense or made
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
I have a question about the Pharaoh. Um, is that the let my people go Pharaoh? The same
Nope.
Pharaoh?
Nope. No. And that was 430 years later.
Well, I know people lived like really long back then.
you are correct, but and well, okay. If you look in Exodus chapter 1, so you know I don't make stuff up. Verse 8 of Exodus chapter 1. Now there arose a new king or a new Pharaoh over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Okay, so it's kind of like
The backstory to that is it was a different dynasty, a different ethnicity, a different ethnic group that came in and conquered Egypt. So they kicked out the previous dynasty who knew Joseph and was and loved Joseph, because we'll see as we go through the rest of Genesis that Pharaoh not only welcomes Joseph's family back, he provides for Joseph's family and gives them the very best of the land. He loved Joseph, and he loved Joseph's family and honored Jacob, Joseph's father. But it's when a new king arose, and you have to go back in secular history to understand what that's talking about. It was a different ethnic group that came in and defeated that dynasty and created a new dynasty. And they knew that the Israelites were friends of the former dynasty. They were allies of the former dynasty. And so they were afraid of the Israelites. And so let's make them slaves, because we don't want them to be free to fight against us in case the other dynasty comes back. And that's for the history geeks that like history. So you don't really need to know that. Yeah, a different Pharaoh. Different Pharaoh arose, did not know Joseph.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Going once. Going twice.